Welcome. I am glad to see each of you here, and I am looking forward to this evening's presentation as our topic tonight will be natural selection. Are we chance or chosen? Now, before we get into that, I'd just like to share something on little snippets of creation health from time to time in this series, basically because if the Bible's record of creation is true, then we should expect that if God made everything well, then he should know how we should take care of our bodies. Would you agree with that? And it also gives us an evidence that, another evidence, as we look at medical science and our bodies, it gives us another evidence of the God that we serve, of the truths that he tells us and the truthfulness of the Word of God. So many people think that God is out to rob them of joy and to rob them of pleasure. But that is not at all what God is after. We will find in John chapter 10, verse 10, Jesus says that, he says, I am come that they might have life, or the thief comes to steal and kill and destroy, but I am come that they might have life and they might have it more abundantly. Jesus came to give us abundant life. He came to give us abundant life, not to rob us of joy, not to give us requirements that are heavy and hard to deal with, but to maximize life. Anything that God requires of us ultimately is to make us happy. So John tells us in 3 John verse 2, Beloved, I wish above all things that you prosper and be in good health, even as your soul prospers. So God wants us to prosper, and he wants our health to prosper, to be in good health. So let's take some time in some of the beginnings of some of these sessions just to deal with some of the issues. Tonight, let's look at the amazing health benefits of water. Water. Did you know that you can dramatically affect your risk of heart disease and stroke by drinking water or by not drinking water? You can make a difference. We will see that water intake and heart disease and stroke, we will see some of the relationships here. This study here out of Loma Linda University gives us some fascinating things here. This study is showing the correlation between fatal coronary heart attacks according to the intake of first water and then fluids other than water. So the first chart here, first stat here, we can talk about U.S. stats, or we can talk about the Canadian statistics. Coronary heart disease deaths are nearly 70,000 annually in Canada. So it is still a significant killer even in Canada. Water, though, when we're talking about the water and the cups of water that we'll look at here in some of these statistics, we're looking at 12-ounce glasses of water, which is just under a third or just over a third of a liter. And you'll see that the fatal coronary heart disease, according to the intake of water in males, 11,000 people studied in this study. If you see the green is less than 2 glasses a day, the blue is 3 to 4 glasses a day, and the white is 5 glasses a day, you can see that you can significantly reduce your risk of fatal heart attacks by as much as 35% just by drinking 3 to 4 glasses a day, and as much as 54%. You can cut your risk in half by drinking 5 or more glasses of water a day. Wow. So, as far as other fluids go, some people think, I don't like water, so I'll drink other fluids. I'll drink other things. Well, we want to look at that as well. Less than 2 servings a day, 3 to 4 servings a day versus 5+ servings a day. Look at this, and this is again in males. You see that we can increase our risk of heart attacks by drinking other fluids, significant amount of other fluids a day rather than drinking water. Females, very similar statistics. You almost cut the risk in half by drinking water instead of fluids. And actually, for women, your risk of heart attack is almost tripled by drinking other fluids. So we want to make sure that we drink our fluids, drink our water, not just fluids, not just juices, coffees. You need water. And water does many things. I won't get into all the benefits of it here right now tonight, but I'll simply say that it came in handy for me last night. As we were entering into the meeting, I was realizing it had been a long day, and my mind was weary. I was tired. And thankfully, I had some people here that we had prayer in one of the offices here before we came out, and I really want to give God all the credit for it. But as I sat down there, the thought came to me, I need to drink water. So I drank from my water bottle, knowing that I need to hydrate my brain for it to work well. And I don't know about you, but I was, knowing how weary I was really excited at how well the presentation came out last night. And I think the Lord blessed that, because that wasn't me. I was pretty tired. So make sure you get your water. You may not have a taste for water, but if you continue to drink it, you will acquire a taste for water. So, and fill up on God's tonic. As we continue here, we want to welcome you again. Tonight's message is natural selection. Are we chance or are we chosen? When Charles Darwin sailed to the Galapagos Islands in 1831, he witnessed the variety of species and noticed that there were definite relationships between many of these species, whether it be the finches or some of the iguanas or other animals. And through that, he developed his theories of evolution. He concluded that species have diversified one from another and extrapolated it all the way back that they all diversified from one single organism in the very beginning. And his method, his mechanisms of evolution that he proposed were random variations. Today we refer to that as mutations, and natural selection. Each of these are so significant. We'll take time tonight to look at natural selection. Tomorrow night we'll look at random variation and just look at the facts and see how they add up to his theory and to the truth. So if it brings us back to the question, can we reconcile evolution, Darwin's evolution, with the Bible? Are they reconcilable? And or who do we trust? And what are the implications of what we learned tonight for us spiritually, for us physically? So this is the sort of thing we want to study out. Some historical context. We looked at this quote the first night. Darwin, writing to a friend of his, said, "I am almost convinced, quite contrary to the opinion I started with, the species are not," it's like confessing to a murder, "immutable." And I mentioned a little bit, I'm going to go into some more detail here about this quote. In his day, the historical context, in his day, the religious world, influencing the scientific world, believed that species do not change, that the species that we see in the world today are the same species that God created in the beginning. They're the same species that came off the ark. And his work said, I don't think so. I think there's room for variability. There is room that they not only have diversified, but they've all diversified from one single organism in the beginning. So he was attacking a dogma, and it was a dogma, quite entrenched at that time. Does the Bible teach immutability of species? Well, you can see Genesis 1, verse 11. God said, "Let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind on the earth." And it was so. So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm according to their kinds. And then we find later on in verse 21, it goes on to say about the birds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. The Bible speaks of kinds. It is not obviously it's not a very specific, it's not a very detailed description here, but rather than speaking of species, it speaks of kinds of animals. It perhaps is a broader sense, more like genus or family, but there is in this a built-in capacity for variety, for variation, for diversity. The scientific, scientists sometimes say, well, you're being too vague. The concept of kind is too vague. You can basically make it say what you want with that. Fair enough, it's not very specific. The Bible isn't very specific about it, but if you want to be specific about species, you have to understand that even the definition of species from a secular scientific perspective is not as clear-cut and set in stone as scientists would like to make it be. Is a species an animal that cannot breed with others similar to it? Does that distinguish it as a species? Some people think so, but there are many examples, whether it's the bird world or others, where you can interbreed species. So the line between what is and is not a species is not always so clear even in science. I happen to be an avid bird watcher, and I'm always tickled to watch as the American Birding Association sometimes will make changes to the species list and say, well, these two species we actually find out are one and the same animal, one and the same species. So they lump them. Or this bird we thought was one species, we've really come to realize it's maybe 4 or 5 species. So they split them, and you have these lumpers and splitters. All that to say that even the definition of species is not as clear-cut as scientists would like to make it out to be. Sometimes creationists make their argument too strong, too black and white when they're arguing about evolution. We may not be open to the idea of change. Or we may argue for a concept known as microevolution, saying that microevolution, which is changes that we see within a species, is observable, but we don't observe macroevolution, which is evolution above species, beyond species. One species evolving into another species. But when you actually look at the literature, that is not a fair argument either, because there are examples that you have to admit are of animals that have diversified into new species that we have observed over time. So the macroevolution argument is not as cut dry as you'd want it to be. But according to these two definitions, science has observed microevolution, species changes within a species, and macroevolution. But what has not been observed is one type of animal, one kind of animal, such as a lizard, evolving into another kind of animal, such as a turtle. We have not observed that sort of change. We do see species evolving, but those species remaining within the kinds of animals that God originally created. And Genesis 1:24 says much the same thing that the rest of the book of Genesis 1 chapter on creation says. And God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things and beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and it was so. According to the Bible, there are different kinds of flesh. Paul actually describes this in 1 Corinthians 15:38. But God gives it a body as he has chosen, and to each kind of seed its own body. All flesh is not the same flesh, but there is one kind of flesh of men, another flesh of beasts, another of fishes, and another of birds. So even Paul describes the various different kinds of flesh. Now, Darwin summarized his process, his theory of evolution, by saying that natural selection acts only by taking advantage of slight successive variations. She can never take great and sudden leaps, but must advance by short and sure, though slow steps. This was his thoughts on natural selection. immediately obvious is the fact that if it's short and sure, but those slow steps, there are many creatures that we would never be able to observe evolving because of the long generation times. We will come back to short generation times, things like bacteria and flies, fruit flies that have been used in the labs for decades. But for now, if you're talking about something that has a few decades lifespan, it's too long of a lifespan for us to observe changes over time to see them actually evolve. So Darwin's theory cannot be proved when we're talking about larger organisms on the basis of observation. We've observed kinds of animals changing. It would take too much time for us to actually observe. It is based on inferences. Darwin's theory is based on inferences, and I want to make that clear. When we see smaller changes in the lab, we see some adjustments, we see some adaptations of bacteria. They're still the same species, but we say, oh, it made a change, and if it can make that small change, then maybe it can make larger changes over longer periods of time. Those changes would accumulate, and we would have new species. It is inferred, the smaller changes are inferred or extrapolated to larger species, to larger changes. It is also inferred from what we call transitional forms in the fossil record. We will talk about that in a future night, or statistics. It is the investigation of these three lines of evidence that we need to see if they are founded upon truth or upon assumptions. If none of these can be established beyond assumption, then pretty much we don't have much to believe in with Darwin's theory. So the question can be asked, can natural selection and mutations produce large-scale change of Darwinian evolution? That's the big question. To answer that question, we ask another, do we even see natural selection at work? Do we see survival of the fittest, natural selection at work in the world around us? We do. You see it on almost any documentary, nature documentary, where one animal is being hunted or attacked by another. It either survives or it doesn't, right? Yeah. We see it at work, but is it the source? Is that the source of all the diversity of life that we see today? That's really the big question. Does natural selection have its limits? The answer to that question is yes, natural selection has its limits. So let's look at some of the limiters to natural selection. The first is the selective advantage an animal is born with. You see, the selective advantage an animal is born with is what Darwin was proposing. By contrast, maybe some of you remember high school biology being taught about this concept. It's called Lamarckism. Lamarck is the one who developed this, that giraffes got their long necks because they were trying to reach out and bite take the leaves from higher up in the branches, and the higher up they stretched their neck, they were able to pass that trait on to their descendants. Let's think about this for a minute. If I happen to have an accident and cut off my thumb, and then I go on and I have children, how many thumbs are my children most likely going to have? 2, right? What has happened in my life physically is not going to affect genes that they have. Lamarckism is not Darwinian evolution. It is not the changes that we make or acquire in this life that we can pass on to our next of kin or to the next generation. That is not what Darwin taught. It is Lamarckism. And so natural selection is limited to the genetic information that the organism starts off with. And I'm going to say this, it's going to sound like a broken record tonight, and I just hope you get it. Natural selection cannot produce new genetic information. And yet there is this field of study of genetic study that has opened up in the last decade that is just wide open new field of genetics that is called epigenetics. And it's epi meaning over. So it is the area of genetics that oversees the genes. And it basically is telling us, what we're basically finding out is that there are many mechanisms that control how genes are expressed. One of the most fascinating conclusions to epigenetics in my mind is that we are finding that by the lifestyle choices we make, we can actually change our genes. We can change our genes, but it is really more along the lines of the expression of our genes. It's not changing the actual genetic code, it's just changing how they are expressed. And I'll talk some more about that in a little bit. So epigenetics is going to be fun to watch what epigenetics does to Darwinian evolution, to this whole debate of creation and evolution. But it is fascinating to me nonetheless. So Lamarckism is not Darwinian evolution, and yet sometimes you hear it still used. Maybe how the monkeys learned over time to start walking, or how dinosaurs learned how to fly, and they pass this on to their next generation, and fly and turn into birds, change into birds. But all of that to say that one of the limiters of natural selection is that it is the selective advantage an animal is born with. What the animal has when it comes out of the womb, comes out of the egg, and its genes, that advantage is what natural selection will use. The second limiter is what we call the equalizing forces in the gene pool. Darwin assumed natural selection has no limits, as do many modern evolutionists. But we need to consider some of the following here. For instance, when Darwin observed the beak finches on the Galapagos Islands, he noticed that they were obviously related, and extrapolated that they had surmised that they had a common origin, and that they were genetically they were all very similar. They had common origin, but they had diversified. They had a common ancestor, and these helped him formulate his vision, his theory. During the 1970s, Peter and Rosemary Grant began working among those finches on Daphne Major Island in the Galapagos. And during this time, in 1977, they watched as the medium ground finches, population of medium ground finches, were reduced down to 15% their original population, as a result of a drought that happened around that time in 1977. And according to them, they had just witnessed, I should say that the result of that 15% that survived, they were slightly larger. They had slightly larger beak size as well. And so the Grants said, we had just witnessed what is called a selection event. And they extrapolated from this that it would take maybe 20 such selection events to make a new species. But they were assuming something here. They were assuming that there are no limits to the gene pool. They were also assuming that such things would not be equalized over time. In 1983, heavy rains, El Nino in the islands there, actually reversed the changes that they had seen in 77. And furthermore, rather than see a divergence of species, they began to witness more of a convergence, various species seeming to blend together during that time. The total of Grant's work does not show evolution, but equalizing forces in the gene pool that keep things from changing. Changes are possible, but there are forces within the gene pool that keep things stable. And they were also assuming 20 selection events, there'd be a new species. They were assuming that there is no limits to the genetic information. You see, for all the variety of these finches on the Galapagos Islands, I have no problem agreeing with Darwin that they must have come from an original, from an ancestor or a few ancestors that were all of one species, and that they diversified from there. But all of that genetic information would have been in the ancestor, in their common ancestor. And in order to change the range of sizes of beak finches, to change the range of changes possible in the populations we see there, in order to change that range, we would actually have to expand or change the genetic information itself. Because the genetic information is like computer code. You can't expect that you can start doing things outside of the computer code. You need to change the computer code itself. There is built-in variety in the gene pool for change, for diversification. That code not only has built-in variation, but built-in limits. You know, every time breeders go to, whether it's dogs or pigeons or whatever, they go to breed something to take a trait and breed it to an extreme. They eventually run into barriers. They eventually run into limits. And as they approach the limits, what they oftentimes discover is they run into infertility and other issues with that species, with those animals. One of my favorite dogs, I grew up having German Shepherds as a kid, and well aware that, you know, German Shepherds are a fairly special breed of dog, and one thing that they're very prone to is called hip dysplasia. And their hips, especially as they get older, can fracture easily and have other issues there. So not only do you run into infertility, but you can run into deleterious or negative traits. So breeders will often take one trait and they'll emphasize it. Say they want to come down to, I don't know if you've ever held a teacup chihuahua in your hand. I had an opportunity to, one of the first times I did this series, I was visiting some of the attendees, and this little thing is just sitting there just trembling, so frail. And I remember looking at that and thinking, wow, they have tried to breed this dog down to as small as they can go. And in the end, they have something that is extremely frail. When you breed something to emphasize some aspect, some trait of it, you oftentimes bring with it some negative trait as well. So there are limits to the gene pool. But for new limits, to expand those limits, you need new genetic information. So natural selection is limited by the selective advantage an animal is born with, the equalizing forces within the gene pool, and by its inability to create new genetic information. I've already said it, and I've told you I'm going to be a broken record here. Natural selection does not produce new genetic information. It only selects from what's already there. For new information, we need Darwin said random variation. He had no clue at that time what mutations are. Mutations today fill the role of random variations, Darwin's theory. Darwin's observations, actually contrary to citing examples of new variation, were almost all better explained by Gregor Mendel's work, a Catholic monk in South America who, if you remember high school biology and ever having to do the Punnett squares, where you have two genetic traits on one side and two here, and you're looking at the combinations that you can get in breeding an animal or a plant or whatever. He's the father of modern genetics, because in his breeding of peas, he started coming up with this idea that there are genes, there are traits that each animal, each organism passes on. Had Darwin known of his theory, he was a contemporary of Darwin, it would be questionable whether or not Darwin would have continued with his theory of evolution. Mutations today provide the raw genetic material needed for expanding the genetic limits. And as I said already, we will devote time to that tomorrow night. So the fourth limiter to natural selection is the fact that it tends to eliminate rather than create new variety. For instance, the peppered moth, and actually you'll find this in one of the chapters in your book here. The peppered moth is cited in biology, I remember it in high school biology, as an example of evolution in action. Originally, trees that had much of the lichens on them seemed like a great hiding place for the peppered moth, except for the few variants of the melanistic or dark phase moth. But then, and this is in England, then during the Industrial Revolution, the trees became more sooted, more blackened, and over time, the original peppered moth became more endangered because it was more vulnerable, whereas the black moth was the one now that could actually camouflage. But let's take it at face value there. We've got this situation where the vast majority of the moths are this color, and then there's a few variants of there, and over time, kind of tip the scales the other way because of the change in the trees. Natural selection will come in and select out the dark moth for survival, which means the other moth is being selected for the trash can. It is choosing natural selection through, whether it be birds coming and picking things off the tree or whatever. It is choosing one for survival, and the other it is getting rid of. It is eliminating. Natural selection eliminates. It doesn't create new variety. Whereas you had two varieties in the beginning, you now have one, or predominantly one. So how can you start with a process, natural selection, that eliminates in order to make new variety, more and more variety? How do you do that? Natural selection has not generated new genetic variation. In this case, where did the black moth come from? Where did the two varieties come from? Not from natural selection. Natural selection only would select between them one or the other. The information was already there. The variety was already there before natural selection takes place. So the same thing applies to bacteria, antibiotic resistance for bacteria, DDT-resistant mosquitoes, or various other things like that. Yes, we can see changes, but in most cases, and I will qualify this tomorrow night, in most cases, the selective advantage was already present before the selecting agent. So with bacteria, the antibiotic resistance was already present before the antibiotic came into play and wiped out all those that didn't have the antibiotic resistance. Does that make sense? It was already there. Natural selection didn't produce the information. It just selected from what was already there. And in the past, there used to be far more diversity in the animal and plant and animal kingdom than there is today. Natural selection is surely eliminating species. When you go back and look at the geologic column, it looks like at the very beginning, in the Cambrian Explosion, we call this the Cambrian Explosion, where a vast majority of species came into existence, or at least appear in the fossil record toward the beginning, and then they've kind of dwindled from there. The Cambrian Explosion is a big challenge to evolution. Where did all this variety, how did it come about so fast? But natural selection is surely doing away with variety rather than making new variety. And we still don't know where that variety actually came from, because natural selection does not answer how that built-in capacity for variance came to be. So, the fifth limiter to natural selection is the fact that it can only act on the expressed genes. I need to define two terms here: genotype and phenotype. Your genotype is the complete set of your genes. You have 3 billion code, 3 billion bits of information from your mother, 3 billion bits of information from your father in every cell in your body. And that complete set is your genotype. Your phenotype is that which is expressed. So I could illustrate it this way. This is a picture of my eye. My phenotype, what is expressed, is green eyes. Now, I have good reason to believe that my phenotype is green eyes and blue eyes. How do I know? Well, blue eyes is considered recessive. There may be some exceptions, but by and large, blue eyes are recessive, which means that if there's any other gene in place, it's going to dominate. In this case, in my case, green. So I have green eyes. So in order to have blue eyes, you need a blue and blue. And then I look at, well, my wife has blue eyes, and my 3 kids have blue eyes. So if they have blue eyes, they must have blue, which means they got one of those blues from me. So my genotype would be blue-green. Does that make sense? My phenotype is what is expressed. It is green. And there is a law in evolution that natural selection, can only operate at the level of the phenotype, of the expressed gene, never at the level of the genotype. So the latent genes, the unexpressed genes are of no consequence to natural selection. I mean, if you think about it in terms of, say, a lion, you've got 2 men walking in a park in Africa, and they come upon a lion. One of the men happens to be very tall and skinny. The other one happens to be pretty short and not so skinny. And all things else equal, who do you think is going to be selected for survival? Probably the tall, skinny one, right? Whereas the other one becomes lunch. Tall and skinny, short, not so skinny are phenotypes. They are what is expressed. It doesn't matter if the short man has genes for longer legs that never got expressed for some reason. It's of no consequence to him right there, is it? Natural selection isn't worried about, it's an unintelligent process of survival of the fittest. It is not worried about, it doesn't think about, oh, I wonder what genes this one has that are not being expressed. It's only what is expressed that is relevant, that is of any value in this situation. Natural selection can only act on the expressed genes, and it cannot produce new genetic information. It can only select from what's already there. And as I've already said, I'm sounding like a broken record, what is needed, otherwise is needed, is mutations. Darwin actually got much of his theory of natural selection from his own breeding experiments with intelligently guided selection, breeding experiments of pigeons and of dogs, and he extrapolated that these things could be formulated for the natural world. These things occur on a natural level as well. When we talk of dogs, you can look at this, this is just a very small sample of the vast variety of dog breeds out there. As you look at, you see a great deal of variety in those dog breeds. One thing that we need to pause here for a minute and consider is that these breeds are all one species. All the dogs all domesticated dogs are one species. Now I know, and I would assume there are some exceptions to this statement, that there are, but the vast majority of that genetic information was there before the breeding programs ever started. And they would have all of that genetic information, the vast majority of it, with the exception of a few mutations, would have been present in the original ancestor to the dogs, which would be the wolf. So that blows my mind, to consider that the wolf has all that genetic information, all that genetic variability, all that capacity for change and variance within the genetics of one animal. That's what God has, when he says he made them after their kinds, there is room for variation within the creation system. There is room for diversification limited diversification within the creation system. And also fascinating here is that there are cases in which, one case in particular, where using that variation, we've actually brought, some have actually claimed to have brought an animal back from extinction. The quagga, a type of zebra that went extinct in 1883 before anybody even realized what had happened. And the quagga, it went extinct, and then in 1984, 101 years later, blood vessels on skins in museums were tested DNA-wise, and it was discovered that the quagga is genetically identical to zebras. And so a group of men began working together in what's called the Quagga Project to go through a few generations of breeding to try to bring the quagga back into existence from the zebra. And after a few selective generations, a few selective breedings, they claim to have achieved their goal in new quagga specimens. So fascinating when you just look at that, we begin to realize, again, this comes back to how do you define a species? So lots of, in summary here, the limiters, natural selection, the selective advantage an animal is born with, the equalizing forces within the gene pool, its inability to create new genetic information, the fact that it tends to eliminate rather than create new variety, and the fact that it can only act on the expressed genes. And yet, those are the main five. There are others that we could talk about here. Just one other I will deal with of irony is chance. Let's say you have a school of krill somewhere in the ocean, and the krill are swimming around and breeding with each other, and some of them start developing selective advantages, whether it's for finding a mate, whether it's multiplying faster or maybe just a little bit moving a little bit faster, whatever the case may be. There's some work on natural work going forward here on their natural selection, on their evolution, it would seem. And then you have something like a whale just come up and take a gulp out of the huge portion of that school of krill. What advantage were those selective advantages that they've been breeding into the system? What advantage were they to this situation? Nothing. A whale comes up and gulps them, and by chance, all that work, natural work, is gone. It is argued that natural selection is not chance. Evolution is not a matter of chance. It is the process of survival of the fittest and traits that survive sticking around. But we actually have to ironically look at the fact that chance itself can eliminate natural selection. It can hinder, it can limit natural selection. So, and then there are other areas where we have to qualify what is change, what is evolution, and what is not. What is evolution by natural selection and what is not. Here's a case of blind fish. You can go into caves in the world and you can see blind crayfish, blind salamanders, blind crickets, blind fish. In this case, the fish has no skin coloration, scale coloration, pigment, and it has no eyes. Are these new species? Well, apparently not, because they have, they're practically identical to their light-dwelling counterparts, except they lack the eyes and the skin color. Well, they can apparently rapidly form in darkness and make these changes in the absence of light, in the blackness of caves. Is it evolution? No. Apparently light can switch on. If light can switch on or switch off the genes that control the eyes or the pigments, then it's not a matter of evolution, it's just a matter of genes being switched on or off. Without the light, the species begins turning off the needed genes for the eyes and the skin color, the pigment, because it doesn't need it. The genes are present, but they're just not expressed. And this has actually been proven through experimentation, where they have taken a cornea, a lens from a fish, and they have planted it on the fish itself, embedded it in the fish. I don't know if they put it on the skin over here, if they put it in the eye socket. I don't really know all the details in the study, but what I do know about the study is that having done this, the body began producing an eyeball around that cornea, signifying that the genetic information is still there for an eye. It's just not expressed. By the way, humans have genes that are not expressed. Some of them, maybe you're thankful for, maybe you feel like you're missing out, but we have genes for a much broader perception of smell that are just not turned on. Maybe that's a good thing. I don't know. Maybe there's things I don't want to smell. Maybe I'm missing out. I don't know. Humans and primates have genes for the production of vitamin C. They're just not expressed. They're just not turned on for whatever reason. If they were turned on, we wouldn't have to eat fruit to get our vitamin C. We could get it just by making it ourselves. So these are not mutations. They're genetic switches. Does that make sense? So natural selection is inadequate as a means of large-scale change. There are limits to genetic variation. And natural selection does not produce any new genetic information. It only selects from what is already there. Now, evolution argues sometimes that sexual reproduction increases the genetic information, increases the genetic variation. Genetic recombination is produced by fertilization, meiosis, independent assortment, and crossing over. But none of these produce any new genetic information. They actually shuffle what is already there. If you can imagine having been given a deck of cards that has no aces in it, and then you are told to shuffle the deck until you produce an ace. Will you ever be able to produce an ace by shuffling the deck? No, because it's not there. The same with genetic recombination. The only recourse evolutionists have for new genetic information is not natural selection, it is mutations. Now, evolutionists love to cite examples of evolution in action, even to the point of new species. But those changes are still minute compared to the changes of the large scale, necessary for the large scale variety that we see in life today. What has yet to be demonstrably demonstrated or exhibited is the large scale change. It is merely inferred from the smaller scale. We see little changes in fruit flies or bacteria or whatever, and we extrapolate and say, oh, well, we must be able to, if this were to continue on for eons, we should be able to see larger changes. But hopefully, as you can see tonight, there are limits. There are limits that would keep that from happening unless there is new genetic information. And we will take a look and answer that question tomorrow night about mutations. So, the question comes back down to, and I'm not going to do this every night, but it is fitting here as well. What takes more faith to believe? Natural selection, which cannot produce new genetic information, that has never been observed to produce large-scale changes as the source of all the variation we see today, or that God built that variation into the system itself when he first created the earth, with all of its kinds able to produce and reproduce with capacity for variation. What takes more faith to believe? Now, natural selection basically says you're an accident, you're chance. You're the product of chance and survival. But what does the Bible teach? The Bible teaches us in Ephesians 1, verse 4, according as he has chosen us in him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and without blame before him in love. God has not left things up to chance with us. I recoiled in horror one time when I listened to a mother relate to everyone present at a meal how her son her last son was an accident. And I just thought, oh man, even if it's true, why would you be saying this in front of the child, in front of everybody else? How damaging that must be to the child's sense of worth. God has not left us to accident. How damaging it must be. But evolution tells us that if you are the product of evolution, you are the product of chance. You are the product of an accident. But the Bible doesn't teach that. It teaches just the opposite. God knows us. He knows what he made from us, what he made us for. And it tells us that we are not an accident of unintelligent chance. Even those here, if there's someone here today who is, you are not intended, your parents did not intend for you to be here, know that God still knows you. God still intended. God still knew what he was doing. You are not an accident in his mind. You are a child of God and most precious in his mind. If you are one of those accidental children, take heart. God chose you before the foundation of the world began. More than that, he has plans for you. In Jeremiah 29, verse 11, he says, for I know the purposes which I am purposing for you, says the Lord, purposes of peace and not of evil, to give you a future and a hope. Not only are you not an accident in God's mind, but you actually have a future, a hope. God has purposes for you. Purposes as his children. The Bible, natural selection also conveys the idea of survival of the fittest. Very competitive. And if we're going to be in this world, if we're going to survive in this world according to the paradigm of natural selection, we are going to have to stay. It's a cutthroat world out there. We got to stay on top of things. We've got to not let the other person get ahead of us. It's very competitive. It has a very competitive component. God actually works just the other way. It is fascinating to consider how God treats us, how he deals with us. Romans 5 tells us, for while we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. For one would scarcely die for a righteous person, yet peradventure for a good man, though perhaps for a good person one would dare even to die. But God shows his love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. God he's not expecting you to get your act together to come to him. In fact, what is fascinating to me is to look through the stories in the scriptures. You can look at Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. You can look at Joseph. You can look at Moses, David, Peter, and others. And you can see a God who doesn't meet us in our successes and say, you've got promise. Come be a part of my system here. Let's go for it. God actually comes to us in our failures. Not in our successes, but in our failures. And says, let me make a covenant with you. Let me make a covenant with you. God, he works on grace, not something we deserve, but something out of his goodness. He says, you've blown it. Now let me show you what I can do. Give me a chance. Let me show you what I can do for you that you cannot do for yourself. That awes me about God. It's not about works, because we come to him in our failures, not in our successes. So friends, you're not an accident. You are loved by your Creator. He has purposes for you. And even when you've blown it, God still comes to you and says, hey, even at the right time, even when you are weak, even at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. And he has plans for you, eternal plans for you, to give you a future and a hope. Is that a big comfort to you? I don't know about you, but that's a big comfort to me. A very big comfort. How many of you would just like to say, God, I need that kind of God. It's a cutthroat world out here, survival of the fittest, and I'm not fit. I'm not the fittest. I need you to carry me through this world. I need you to take me in my failures and do something with me. Give me your plans, your future, your hope. How many of you just like to say that tonight? Amen. Amen. Well, let's bow our heads for prayer. Father, thank you. And thank you that you have shown us in modern science today that there are limits to natural selection, but there are not limits with you. You created the vast variety, the capacity for variety and change within the various kinds of living organisms today. And it also speaks to us of your love for not only variety, but your love for us, your plans for us, what you want to do for us. If you can make countless breeds of dogs or allow them from a wolf, what is latent within each of us that you want to do within each of us? Thank you for that. And thank you that you love us not because we're good, but like a father, like a parent who loves their child, not because they're good, but because they're their child. You love us. Lord, forgive us of our sins. Bless us to find you as the God who comes to us in our failures, picks us up, and shows us what you can do for us. And we thank you for your loving kindness. In Christ's name I pray. Amen.